Good evening. I'm Mary Lee Kiernan, President and CEO of YWCA Greenwich, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the special annual conversation honoring the lives of both Coretta Scott and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., renamed this year to honor the contributions of Coretta Scott King and the other women who were central to the civil rights movement. Our purpose every January is to lift up and examine a contemporary issue that they would have cared about and fought for were they still with us, an issue that would be part of their vision of a just society. As Dr. King said in one of his most enduring statements, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Building a strong and just community is also central to the mission of YWCA Greenwich and YWCAs across the country and around the world. So it is fitting for us to present to you tonight a powerful panel discussion entitled The Evolution of Gender. We will examine the history and language of gender and policies that impact those who do not identify with traditional male or female identities in our society, such as transgender, non-binary, or other gender expansive identities, and how we can respect and support them within our families, our schools, workplaces, and within our community. Our mission of empowering women and eliminating racism is strengthened when we have conversations such as we are having tonight that deepen our understanding of gender and race. Many thanks to our moderator this evening, Erin O. Crosby, who is the Director of Women's Empowerment and Racial Justice at YWCA Greenwich, and our sincere thanks to our outstanding panelists who Erin will introduce. We are profoundly grateful to you, our panelists, for your participation tonight and the work that you do every day. I would also like to thank the more than 40 community partners who have joined us to co-sponsor and advertise this important event, and we commend them for their partnership in promoting a just community. These partners are now on the screen and include schools, houses of worship, parts of town government, and nonprofits from all across Greenwich. Also partnering with us tonight for our important event are several of our elected officials. So we would now like to play a short video with greetings from Senator Richard Blumenthal and Congressman Jim Himes, and then we'll hand it over to Erin to introduce our topic further, and then our panelists. So thank you for being with us and enjoy the conversation.
Hi, I'm Richard Blumenthal, your United States Senator, really proud and excited to be joining you for this immensely important celebration of the lives and legacies of both Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. My thanks to Mary Lee Kiernan and her team for this tremendous panel on the evolution of gender and your work day in and day out to combat racism, gender discrimination, religious intolerance, domestic violence. These causes are of paramount importance every day, but we recognize them as causes particularly in connection with Coretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr. I am proud to join you in this fight against the continuous, insidious plague of racism and gender discrimination, support the Equality Act and voting rights advances and protections, and to raise awareness, as you are doing today. Thank you on behalf of all of us who live in Greenwich and Connecticut, and all of us who support the great work of the YWCA. Thank you all.
I'm Congressman Jim Himes, and I want to give a big thank you to the Greenwich YWCA for sponsoring this Dr. King and Coretta Scott King conversation. This, of course, is the latest installment in a years-long effort by the Greenwich YWCA to highlight issues of equity and ongoing discrimination in our society through constructive and empathetic community conversations. Thank you for participating. We have a tendency, or at least I have a tendency, to emphasize the remarkable work that Martin Luther King did on issues of racial equity. and the civil rights movement, which he led decades ago. And we therefore have a tendency to de-emphasize the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King was really at his core about combating injustice against anyone who was marginalized or disenfranchised. And there's no doubt in my mind that were he with us today, he would be at the forefront and commenting on our society's work to make sure that gender and gender issues are at the forefront of making sure that every single American feels fully welcome in our society, that they are equal before the law and that they are equal in standing and dignity in our society. These aren't necessarily easy conversations to have. We've made real progress on LGBTQ issues, but when you look at issues like the rate of suicide amongst transgender youth, you realize that we have a long way to go. And it is this sort of conversation that advances the cause and makes us all better and more empathetic people. So again, thank you very much for participating in today's conversation.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's good to have y'all with us tonight. Each year when we host this event, we include a quote from Dr. King on the event flyer. With that quote, we hope to challenge our community and to inspire resilience as we march toward justice. And we want to remind people that our past ideas and actions shape our present existence, and accordingly, that our present ideas and actions will shape our future. In 1963, we heard from Dr. King as he sat in yet another jail in Birmingham, Alabama. He wrote a letter to his fellow clergymen in response to their statements that his present activities were unwise and untimely. I can only imagine how frustrated and weary and angry he must have been in that moment, knowing that all of his peaceful efforts to have his existence and his being and his life recognized and honored were being met with resistance, reprimands, and refusals. He needed his fellow clergymen to operate in hope and courage rather than paralyzing fear that would uphold oppression and the status quo. He needed them to be about the business of justice now. So tonight's conversation, as you've heard, extends Coretta Scott and Dr. King's vision for justice as our understanding of gender is evolving. For so many people who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and or have another gender expansive identity, being able to exist in the fullness of self is a radically new concept. And I imagine it comes with a great deal of joy and freedom. But this sense of freedom is still perilous, as far too many gender non-conforming people live in fear of violence and exclusion at home and in public, and are regularly denied access to basic needs like housing, healthcare, and safe educational environments. For those who are struggling to understand why and how gender is evolving, and why past notions of male and female, masculinity and femininity don't work for everyone, I imagine that new reality is overwhelming, and that it may feel threatening as people wonder what this means for their own gender identity and how they can navigate the world. We understand that all those thoughts and feelings and questions are moving through this virtual space tonight. What we seek to do during the conversation we have is to provide a foundation and language about gender that first and foremost honors transgender, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming people and communities. We also want to share experiences and learning that helps families, organizations, and communities be gender affirming. And we want to challenge this community to develop policies and practices that support, protect, and include transgender, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming children, youth, and adults. Just as a reminder, justice and equity move everyone closer to liberation. It's always wise and it's always timely. The Center for Equity and Justice at YWCA Greenwich seeks to create a society where neither race, ethnicity, nor gender identity will determine the trajectory or quality of a person's life. So as we get started in tonight's conversation, I'd like to read you Dr. King's quote in full that captures our intention for the event. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So as we get started, I'm going to give a brief presentation about gender. We hope it helps you gain a better understanding of how gender has evolved and why it's evolving. And then I'm going to introduce our panelists. So just a few things about tonight. We encourage you to share your questions throughout the event using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat button to share your questions. We plan to have approximately 15 minutes at the end of the program for your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share our presentation about gender. So many of you know that the language of gender is changing. Some of the words that we have here on the screen will be familiar to some of you. Some of them will be unfamiliar. This is by no means an exhaustive list. So we hope as we go through this evening that you'll pay attention to the language that we're using. If there are terms that you don't know or that we think that you may not know, we're going to try and have what we call literacy moments where we take the time to explain that. But we also encourage you, because just as work is always ongoing work, we encourage you that after you leave here today to continue to look up terms and to familiarize yourself with this topic so that you can continue to grow in it. So when we talk about gender tonight, we're going to be talking about and recognizing that gender is a social construct. And I want to take a little bit of time to unpack what exactly that means. So when we talk about gender, we're talking about it as being socially constructed. We're saying that it was created and developed for a purpose, and that its significance isn't going to come from a natural state, but it's really this interaction and the result of social and historical processes that have happened over time. We also know that the way that we talk about and understand gender in the West is different than in other places and different than it has existed historically. So oftentimes, when we talk about gender in the West, it's constructed in binary terms. We hear about that in other ways when we talk about Black and white, rich and poor, when we also talk about gay and straight. Those things exist on the binary. And what we realize when things exist on the binary is that it has a way of determining who's in and who's out, who's considered otherized and who's considered normal, who belongs and who doesn't. And so we want to pay attention to how that's happening in the world around us, particularly as it relates to this topic. Even though gender can reflect individual and group identities, the reality is that gender exists within systems of power. And so we recognize that who has power is determined based on these ideas that we've created around gender. It also means that certain people with the way that we've created gender are always going to, or very often, experience inequality while others experience equality. So one of the things that we also realize and that we think is just really important to bring forward is that because of the way that we were socialized and that we exist in this country and in Western society, we do think of gender as being exclusively male or female. And the reality is that that idea of gender has not always existed, and it doesn't exist in some places now. We know that anthropologists can look back more than 3,000 years and see the ways in which many societies and people groups had genders that were outside of male and female. So I won't read through all of this information, but wanted you to see some of what's here. So we see that in the Pacific Islands, that if someone was identified as biologically male or female, they could also inhabit roles around gender that were somewhere in between male and female, that encompassed both the masculine and the feminine. We see in African cultures that for those who were gender crossing, that they presented themselves in their adornment, in their dress, in their hair in a way that was similar to women. We also know that in Latin American countries, that we also see that the gods that they worshiped were dual gender gods, unlike in Western society, where many of the gods are considered to be masculine and are considered to be men. We know that today, even in some of these Latin American countries, that they're not identifying based on gay or straight or male or female, but they actually have a third gender that they use in order to identify certain people. We see the same thing as true in Asian countries. So Indonesia has a third gender. We know that there was a people group also in Asia that recognized 5 different genders, and that gender was a combination of sex, gender, and sexuality. And also we know that now in Pakistan and Bangladesh, that they also recognize a third gender that's neither completely male or female. And lastly, we know that in Native American groups, that there have been, at least from what we have found so far, that there are more than 100 instances of gender diverse expression, and that these were true even at the earliest point of European contact here. And it's also important to know that in some Native American groups, they will refer to people as two-spirit. And that is often referred to for people who hold special sort of spiritual characteristics, even though it's around gender and sexuality. It's important for us to say that the identifier of two-spirit is something that should only be used within Indigenous groups. It is not something that other people should use. And as you see here, as you've seen in other groups, the Navajo had 5 genders as well. So again, we're reminded that where we are today is not where we have always been. We hope that this creates the question for most of you about why did it change? What was the purpose for it changing? And what did it seek to achieve? And we want to talk a little bit about that. So how did we come into this idea of 2 genders, male and female? We'll often talk about that as a gender binary, one or the other. And what we know is that in the late 18th and early 19th century, that we start to see a real shift around gender in Western society. So there was a point at which the idea of gender for male and female was that they essentially were the same sex with just slight variations in their body. But then we know that over time, particularly once we get into the Enlightenment period, that male scientists who would have identified as white were using these methods to prove that males and females were anatomically opposite and therefore had different roles. We also know that during the same period, that scientists were using those same methods to establish this idea that there were biological differences between the races. So you see that there's this classification that starts to happen during this time that really sets the pace for who has value and who doesn't, who has rights and who doesn't. And so what we end up with is this binary of male and female. And it's important to remember that that was developed by men to position men as superior. The result of that is that we started to naturalize inequality. One of the ways that I think that this will resonate with our audience is that we see that there was this understanding of this in the women's movement, that this idea of being born a woman meant that you held second-class status based on your gender. We also know that what we develop starts to stick culturally. It gets reinforced, and we see that around gender. We know that institutions start to uphold this idea of what gender should be. We see this, hear this very much in churches or in houses of worship, where there's language around who can be accepted in that faith group, who goes to heaven, who doesn't. We also know that schools are continuing to face this challenge as they think about who has access to certain restrooms, who can play in sports. And we see that institutions end up adopting these things and that it does harm to people. We also know that language can be used as a weapon when we're talking about gender. We won't use any of the terms as examples, but we know that those slurs are always violent, and they're also used to uphold this idea that certain genders are superior to others and are more accepted. We also know that these gender norms are so ingrained in our society that even as certain groups work toward justice around gender, that sometimes they dialed back their work because they were concerned about how working outside of those gender norms might threaten their progress. So again, we just want to remind you that this cultural expectation that starts to get rooted in our society has certain outgrowths that we see in institutions, in our language, and in how we engage in justice work. I just want to remind everyone that because we've had gender expansive identities for a long time, we have also had people working toward justice. And so you can see here just a few examples of the many ways in which people who have gender expansive identities have been working toward equality. While many people know the Stonewall Uprising as a movement that, or an event that really galvanized the gay rights movement in the US and globally, we cannot forget the number of transgender people or gender expansive people who played a role in that. So you see there in that last picture, Marsha P. Johnson, who was critical in that movement. And so I just want to close with this quote from Alok. Alok is a writer, a poet, and a performer. They are also someone who does a lot of work around how do we degender fashion. And one of the things that we see here in their quote is really sort of a modern take, I think, on what we heard from the Dr. King quote earlier. And it's this idea that as a society, if we want to end misogyny, that's not just the work of a single gender group. That's really the work of all genders. And the goal of that is to recognize the ways in whether it was the ways in which it was intentional and the ways in which it was unintentional, that many of us, and in fact, all of us have been harmed in some ways by this dual system of gender. So I'm going to pause there. And I want to take the time just to introduce our panel. I know all of you are interested in getting to that and hearing from them. And I'm very excited that we could bring this group together. I know it's going to be a really robust conversation. And so I'm going to introduce each person and they're going to come on camera and then we're going to get started with our conversation. So first I want to introduce Stephen Chen. Stephen's gender pronouns are he and him. Stephen is a nationally certified facilitator for Welcoming Schools, which is part of the Human Rights Campaign. He also serves as the assistant head of school at Boston Latin School. I'd also like to introduce J.R. Ford and Vanessa Ford. J.R.'s pronouns are he and him, and Vanessa's pronouns are she and her. They are nationally known advocates for LGBTQ+ rights, specifically rights for transgender youth, and they're also the authors of a picture book entitled Calvin. And we also have Cadence Pinthony with us. Cadence's pronouns are they and them, and Cadence is the coordinator of community and corporate learning at Triangle Community Center in Norwalk, and they support the LGBTQ+ community through training and education. All right, y'all, you ready? Let's go ahead and get started. So it's really good to have you all with us. We, as our audience doesn't know this, but y'all, we have been sort of touching base and preparing for this conversation because there are a number of topics that we really just wanted to explore in the time that we had together. And I just want to remind folks that the way that we're engaging in this conversation is really thinking about families who may have gender expansive children, also families that really just want to raise gender conscious children. But we also realize that we have a larger community of people who are stepping into new knowledge around gender. And so we also want to create a space there for those folks. So I want to start off by acknowledging that each of you is doing work to advance LGBTQ+ rights. And I want to start with Stephen. I'd like to hear how you came to be involved in this work and why it's important to you now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erin, for having me. It's great to be here. It's actually interesting in terms of how I came to this work. So I come to this work as an ally. I am myself am not a member of the LGBTQ community. However, one of the things that happened when I finished grad school and started working for the Boston Public Schools was I entered the work through an office called the Office of Equity, which is essentially the civil rights office. And almost from day one, when I stepped foot into that office, I would say every other call that I would get from school principals, from other administrators, and from teachers was actually around, hey, I have a student who has just come out and told me about this identity that I don't know what to do with, right? I need some support. I need some help. Please help us. And when I started getting these calls, one of the first things I did was ask, what resources do we have? What exists? And it turns out that back when I started in 2014, there weren't a lot of resources in our district. And so where I came into this work was really to start from where can I make sure that we find the best practices to make sure that our students have the most safe, affirming, and welcoming environment for our schools so they can really thrive.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think this work is critically important now, Stephen?
Yeah, so I would say that as this work has developed, I have seen the impacts in our schools and for our young people when we do this right. And when I say when we do this right, I've seen what it means to students when you have teachers who are using the correct pronouns, the correct names, when there are forms for student registration that include multiple families, multiple family structures, and not just mom and dad in the structure in the forms, right? I've seen the impact that happens when you have a staff in the schools that are trained to address bias-based incidents on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, or whatever the bias is, and what that means to a student and their ability to learn, to grow, and to really thrive. And so as we do this work and as we start promulgating these best practices, you start to see the importance of this work more and more, because the idea of going backwards or the idea of taking this away now is just so incomprehensible that, like, you're on the right track because our dropout rates are lower, our rates of bullying are lower, everything is lower in terms of all the risk factors that our students face when we implement a lot of these best practices in our schools.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Cadence, I'll toss it over to you. How did you come to be involved in this work, and why is it important?
Sure. So it's impossible for me to acknowledge that I came to this work because it is deeply personal. As a person who identifies as being in the trans community and as non-binary, I see it as wrapped up in my own survival in a lot of ways. And I know that's how many people come to this work. Thinking back to the basics, I was lucky to have, a great foundation in terms of, accepting myself, growing up and, feeling seen and heard for who I was. And I had this experience that I know many folks did. I went to college and I, found our LGBTQ plus and Women and Gender Studies Center. And I said, oh, this sounds really important and right to me. I want to advocate for these people. And then slowly came to the recognition that I was one of these people, which I know is a very common queer experience, especially. And really just had such great foundations, sitting and listening to people who, would call me out, right, for making mistakes, right, recognizing those pieces of privilege, and then really wanting to be in those conversations, because I am not a person who is good at sitting and pretending everything is fine. My head will explode. I have to talk about it, or I can't do it. So yeah. Again, and I'm also really nerdy about it as well. So I'm sitting here like cheering while you're reading through our great, beautiful introduction. So kind of all of those pieces, and I came to the education side of it. So that is my work now, is I'm a community educator, because again, I need to be in those spaces, and I really thrive off of having those real conversations, meeting people where they're at, doing that in a way that's restorative, but that's also accountable. That's so important to me. And I really feel that people do better when they know better. And there's just often such a gap, right, of people just trying to catch up. And that's a very real feeling. So a lot of those things.
Thank you. JR, same question.
Yeah. So our journey came through our child, Ellie, who came and told us that they were who they were back.
2015.
For us, it's been a long time. But our work has really come through the support of Ellie, and that has really opened up a lot of opportunities for us to engage, to educate, to continue to learn about supporting the trans community. So it's been a labor of love over the last 7 years now, that has given us the opportunity to elevate the conversation and to ultimately produce a incredible children's book. But it really has come through, our journey through our child and through our family.
Anything you want to add to that, Vanessa?
I'll just note that I was a teacher for many, many years in DC public schools, and it was amazing how much I didn't know. And so while I come to this work with an educator mind and a parent heart, I find it appalling in some ways how I functioned in the education spaces before our child informed us of who they were. Our child uses they, them pronouns and identifies as transgender, non-binary. And so this journey from having a child who at 4 told us who they were, and now they are almost 11, has been really an evolution for us. And we've been really lucky to be part of this amazing community doing the work to raise awareness and understanding.
Thank you for that. And I hope that our audience got to hear, and that's something that really stood out to me, is this idea of journey, like journey work. Like you start at a place of recognition, something you come into, you have a experience where you realize something needs to change or that you're not understanding of something. And then you set out on the journey. And also the recognition that each of you is still in the journey, whether you hold a certain identity or whether you identify as an ally. And so I just hope that our audience hears that as an invitation as my heater turns over, but that everyone hears that as an invitation to recognize that this is ongoing work. And if today is the first day that you're stepping into this work, then we just ask you to show up tomorrow and the next day. So what I want to do now is, we know that for a lot of folks, this may be a new topic and the language and certain concepts might be new. And so I'm going to put a slide up on the screen that I'm going to ask Cadence to walk through. And part of the reason we wanted to do this is it touches on some ideas around gender and around sex and sexuality. We know that sometimes those things can be intersecting and intersecting. So just want to give a moment for that. So Cadence, I'm going to get that on the screen. I'm just going to advance that slide. All right, can you see that okay, Cadence?
Wonderful, yes.
All right.
Okay, perfect. So yes, this slide is very overwhelming, I know, to look at it first, but this is the slide that I use in LGBTQ 101, which is what we call our foundational training when it comes to talking about who are we talking about? What are we talking about when we're talking about identities and allyship and all of that? So yes, set us up beautifully also, again, in the beginning, because a lot of those pieces I would touch on this slide, because when we are commonly taught, again, most of us are not even taught what gender means, like what sex means, all of those things. Oftentimes those things are very kind of implicit to us. So I really find it's so helpful to actually name all of these pieces. Because again, they're also all conflated together a lot of the time and having to match and all of these kind of different concepts that don't really make sense at the end of the day. Honestly, even if you are not someone who identifies as LGBTQ+. So this first piece that I break down and talk about is the gender identity piece. And the reason I have it represented, if you're looking at our little corresponding colors in the thought bubble, is because gender identity or gender really refers to your deeply personal, internal held sense of self when it comes to what your own gender is. And that is not ever visible to other people. That is deeply your own. You know what that is. You know what that feels like. So really, when we hear people using language like female, woman, girl, non-binary, male, man, boy, especially when we're hearing people self-identify with terms like that, what they're really referring to is their gender identity, right? Their deeply personal, internal held sense of self when it comes to their own gender. I also always like to point out here, not everybody wants or likes to use a term. We're talking about a feeling. It can be very hard to have a name or a label for a feeling that can be vastly different from person to person, right? So not everybody wants a term or a label. Of course, they can be super important to a lot of folks, right? Especially if you feel like you're someone who doesn't fit in the norm. Finding language to explain how you feel in some way that's like, oh my gosh, I exist, right? There's a term for this. It's also a way to build community, right? You can find other people who also identify with that term. So yeah, gender identity is really about that internal sense of self. Our next piece is gender expression, and we can kind of think of this as the flip side. But again, matching, right, is not necessarily a thing. So gender expression is about anything that we might do that's more visible or physical, that is gendered in a way. And when I say gendered, again, as we talked about in the beginning, we as human beings created this concept. And again, it doesn't mean arbitrary. It doesn't mean we can't look at physical things and people and see differences, right? And how that, but we make such strict categories, or we've become a culture in which the categories are so strict as we see that as something that's not as fluid as many people experience it, or as many people would experience if they felt like that was allowed, right? So yeah, what goes into gender expression? Very first thing many of us are thinking of, clothing is always the first one I hear, right? Clothing is very gendered, right? Are you wearing skirts? Are you wearing pants? Are you wearing dresses? What are the colors? What are the shapes? All of those different pieces. Hair is another big one that's gendered. Whether or not you wear makeup, whether or not you wear jewelry, paint your nails, body language even, right? How do you hold yourself? How do you move through space? How do you speak and interact with others? Even the roles that you take on in your family, in your workplace, in anywhere, right, where you're around groups of people. All of those things can be super gendered. And again, we are socialized to do them, right? So what would the world look like if we, didn't feel like either directly implied to us or again, directly told to us or just implied to us that this is the way we had to behave? Because this is such a human created concept, super culturally relative, depending what group we're a part of, what we sorted into what box, right? So let's say our group, our culture, has decided that women and feminine people are the ones who wear skirts and dresses. Could be another culture in a different part of the world that decides men and masculine people wear that type of clothing. So it's super culturally relative. And of course, we know there are people of different cultures and groups, even within our own like physical community spaces, right? Even in our own cities and towns, right? Also, it changes over time. I know I even look back in my own lifetime of things that were once considered very feminine. Now are kind of like things anyone could do, or perhaps are even considered more masculine things to do. I also always like to point out that this idea of being neutral or undefined, or we can even throw the word androgynous in there, is a deeply complicated one. Because again, if you Google androgyny, you get pictures of stick skinny, masculine white people wearing gray, masculine clothing. Because unfortunately, another thing that we do in our culture is we kind of set these ideas of a default identity. And often that is the identity that has been held in power the most, right? So because we see masculinity and maleness as being just the norm, the default thing to be, right? We see androgyny as being put in there. This is something I think about a lot personally. I can't even tell you how many times people say to me, well, you're non-binary. Why are you so feminine? Right? And it's like, well, to me, why can't femininity, if we're truly talking about being androgynous or undefined or in the middle, why can't aspects of what we would consider femininity also be androgynous, right? And of course, we see these cultural defaults with all sorts of identities, again, in ways that have held up oppression. White people, we don't get pointed out to us our racial identity all of the time. We just get to be people, whereas people of color always are people of color, right? We just get to be a default. People without disabilities always just get to be people. People with disabilities are always people with disabilities, right? So I also think talking about what it means to be in the middle is deeply complicated and fraught as well. Sex assigned at birth is our next piece. And this is literally just as basic as you're thinking. 99.9% of the time, all we are doing when we are assigning sex at birth is looking at the genitalia of the baby. It's really just as basic as that. And as was talked about, biology is not set, and we need to make sure that we disrupt this idea of the sex binary as being such a biological imperative, just as much as we are talking about disrupting this idea of gender as the more social piece as being much more of a spectrum. There are so many ways to be a person and exist in a body, just as there is to, feel, who you are. And all of these things are also deeply intertwined, right? So someone who is intersex, because I know that's a term many people haven't even heard before, right? It's just someone who has bodily characteristics, biological and physical characteristics that don't put them into the strict box of either being female or male. And again, this looks like, differences in genitalia. This looks like internal sexual and reproductive organs. This looks like hormone levels. This looks like chromosomes, right? There's more than 2 sets of chromosomes folks can be born with. Unfortunately, a lot of times intersex folks, especially with more visible characteristics, corrective surgeries are still performed, and that's still the norm in the United States of America and like every large country you can think of. It's still a normal practice. It's taught as what's best practice in medical schools, right? And again, people are not unhealthy. We just consider their bodies not the norm. Again, this idea of biological sexual binary is also deeply rooted in racism, right? As was talked about in the beginning, right? Of seeing there has to be differences in people's bodies. And again, we don't just let there be differences, right? We have to assign the inferiority and superior labels, right? We can't just look at things and say they're different. The people in power, at least, can't seem to be able to do that. Deeply ableist as well, right? The assumption that being able-bodied, right, is the norm, at being neurotypical is the norm. All of that stuff is wrapped up in this concept as well. And just lastly, I know we're focusing on kind of the gender and sex pieces, but attraction, right, and how we, feel about each other and build relationships and communities is also wrapped up in, these other pieces as well, and interconnected a lot of time for a lot of folks. So I think I hit my 10 minutes, so I want to leave it at that. But again, I always like to point out that, again, even if we're not LGBTQ+, there's almost none of us that can think about all of these things and say, I check off everything in a line and everything matches up for me and it always has. That's not what it means to be a person, even if you feel pretty aligned right now. Have you always? Will you always? Probably not. It's normal to move and grow and change and along spectrums our whole lives for all sorts of reasons. But unfortunately, we decide to make things like this a big deal when it really is just normal as a human in existence and culture and having relationships.
Thank you for that, Cadence. I know lots of people had questions, and I just want to see if I can capture this in sort of a Cliff Notes version. So gender identity is deeply personal. It is something that the individual determines, and it can be fluid. Sex is something that is assigned at birth. It may or may not match how someone identifies in terms of gender. Expression is the way in which someone chooses to demonstrate how they feel and want to exist in the world. And that can also be evolving and fluid based on what's important to the individual. Okay, great. I was listening. So I just want to do a quick popcorn. And this is, again, so just that we can sort of close out these foundational pieces. So I'm going to popcorn. Stephen, you're first. Why do pronouns matter?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think, we can do statistics and we can talk about research studies, but I think the bottom line is names matter, right? The ways that people identify matter. And so I know that in the schools, what we can talk about is what the research says, right? Which is, we heard earlier in this session some remarks about the risk factors of self-harm, of suicidal ideation, and some of the risk factors around students and young people who are in the LGBTQ community. But we also know that there are some really simple things that people can do to reduce those risk factors. And one of those is actually using the proper names and pronouns. There's actually a 2018 study out of UT Austin that did this exact same, that researched this exact issue. And what they found is it wasn't just a marginal decrease in risk factors. We're talking about 50 to 60% decreases in those risk factors simply by using people's names and pronouns correctly, right? And so when we talk about this, it's core to our identity. It's core to who we are. So if we were to think about our names and how we want to be called as core to our identity, like, of course that would make sense. And I would just go to that fundamental basis of you're denying who a person is if you're not really using someone's pronouns and names.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think I just want to add to that. We're talking about the pronoun and name that they have chosen and that they say they want to be identified as. and also the recognition that, as we've talked about, all of this is evolving. An individual has the right to change those over time and for that to be honored. Okay, Cadence, you're next. So when people express frustration or confusion about the terms used to express gender identity that are not male or female, what do you want them to know?
So, yeah, first thing I always do is I empathize with that confusion, right? Because when we're talking about learning, we're also talking about a lot of unlearning, right? And again, especially when we're talking about concepts and things that we learned unconsciously, that is so much work. So first is I honor that, and that comes from my community educator hat. As a person who exists in the world, sometimes all I want to answer is, because sometimes it's just not about you, right? And that's like a fundamental thing that also is just really hard to think. And I've had so many people in my life teach me how to do this and had such great mentors. Is like sometimes it's just not about me. And I don't fundamentally have to fully understand what it means to be you in order to accept that you are who you are and you're telling me what that is and what you need based on that. Well, also, again, honoring that confusion. So even if I don't personally understand it when it comes to gender and sexuality, there's always going to be other experiences that I'm not going to fully understand because I don't live that personally. So I think making those connections and honestly being really personal with folks is how I kind of make those connections as well. But honestly, so many questions that I want to answer is it's not about you, right? Even when we're talking about pronouns. If someone, told you your name and they looked at you, or told someone their name and they looked at you and they said, you don't look like a so-and-so, like if they looked at me and said, you don't look like a Cadence, you look like a Susie, I'm gonna call you Susie. What? That'd be ridiculous, right? So it's not about, people are who they tell you they are, and it's just gotta get past the mindset sometimes.
That's a great segue. So Vanessa, you are up. We hear sometimes people asking, isn't this a phase? So I want to know what your response would be to that kind of a question.
So early on in our journey, I think we held that question as well. We had a 4-year-old who for a number of years had been gender nonconforming and then was telling us very clearly who they were, what pronouns they wanted to use, that at the time they wanted to be called sister and she, and were being very, very clear in that to us. I think, gosh, I got so wrapped up in thinking about my little 4-year-old that I forgot the question. I'm sorry.
So the question is, when people say, isn't this a phase? Thinking about your 4-year-old, how do you respond?
So I respond that people are who they say they are until they tell you otherwise. This was told to me early on by a therapist who I was seeing when I was trying to make sense of how to support Ellie on this journey. And she said, again, like Cadence said, this isn't about you. People know who they are. And if this is who your child is saying they are, that is who they are. And that has stuck with us through this journey, as our child did for 5 years, use she, her pronouns, and now uses they, them pronouns. Both instances were times where they came to us and said, this is who I am. This is how I want to be addressed. And we had to say, absolutely, because the risk, as Stephen was saying, is too great not to.
I want to continue with you all thinking about Ellie and thinking about you all's journey. So I'm wondering, as you said, you all stepped into this. There was one way that you knew your child, and then there was another way that you needed to know your child. So how did you all support Ellie at home? Because I think that's going to resonate with a lot of folks in our audience.
Yeah, from the beginning, it was a whole family approach. From Ellie's brother to Vanessa and myself, but it was really about us supporting them on their journey. So that meant that we had to educate ourselves. We had to seek out the resources that were available at that time. One of those was a human rights campaign that we connected with. And they were essentially one of the primary focal points for us to start to really either, understand what was going on with our child, but also to educate ourselves and to continue to reach out to people who live that journey, but also who could educate us on what should we consider when we focus on support for our child, affirming their identity, supporting them and, identifying their pronouns, helping them, when they initially identified as she, that journey was continuing to fully support them. So it meant that we were looking at how we were going to continue to support them. We early on,
yeah.
we really did. We went shopping. We went shopping. We listened. It's a funny story about how they identified and how they came to be themselves. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately it came down to a few really simple things. Gender expression and how you're perceived by the world is a really critical thing for trans youth, because you look at a child, and I mean, I've been driving around with both kids in the car and I'll be like, oh, he's so cute. And my kids will be like, how do you know he's a he? And just, even though we've been in this journey, because I saw who I thought was expressing themselves as a boy, I was attributing that. But in Ellie's case, it included clothing, pronouns, talking to the school and creating support plans to ensure that Ellie could use the bathroom that matched their gender identity that they felt comfortable with. It included hair. And what we were doing to style hair or not style hair. And that's still true today. I think that what we've seen is that gender expression, how you choose to express your gender to the world and how they perceive you, is so critical to trans and gender nonconforming people, because there's only so many ways a youth can express themselves, right? We say, here, we buy your clothes. So if we hadn't gone to buy Ellie new clothes when they told us who they were when they were very young, or now when they told us who they were, that's us putting our definition of what they should express themselves to the world. So taking them shopping to pick out different things has been really important. The haircut has been really important. Those things seem small, but they're exponential in kind of the exploration and sense of identity.
Well, and there's something about it too, where I'm realizing the things that we assume, or because of the way we've been socialized, we tell ourselves aren't important for transgender and non-conforming kids. But I can remember going to private school, so we all looked alike. So socks and shoes were like really important to me. Because they were, but it was this way for me to have my own identity. And so it's one of these moments where I say, we understand these things, but then we end up taking them away from children, particularly those who need it most and who are most vulnerable. And so how do we step into that recognition that we know these things? So I want to ask another question. It's about the Fords and their experience. And then I want to bump over to Stephen, because I think you may have had some experiences with this. So I'm also thinking about the reality of what does it mean to go through this transition in a multi-generational way? So we know that kids today have a very different understanding of these concepts. Like, they think us old folks are crazy. Not that I just called any of y'all old, but they think that there's something wrong with us. And then we also have to honor the ways, or walk through the ways in which my grandmother would be in a different place with this. So I'd love for you all to tell us how you navigated that. And Stephen, in terms of the training you all do at Welcoming Schools, I'd like to hear how you all advise on that. So go ahead, Vanessa and JR.
So Ellie transitioned. When a child transitions, the community and family transitions with them. It is so critical that all of these people are on board. And Ellie actually chose their name and their pronouns over the course of a summer and at my parents' house, so their grandparents' house. And so my parents, the intergenerational piece, they were central to that initial day where we were using Ellie for the first time. And we sat as a family with, we talked with Gigi and Papa, who are here tonight, and my sister and brother-in-law. And we said, this is what we're going to do, and this is the support we need. Similarly, from JR's family.
Yeah, the same type of situation was, how can we support? That was the question that we got from, our relatives about what can we do, educating, ensuring that, they use the right pronouns. But there were a lot of, I would honestly say there were a lot of good questions that came from both sides of the family about how can we support, and that actually broke down a lot of walls, I think, about the anxiety and about the stress that we probably were facing, 7, years ago about, what does this mean for our journey?
Mm-hmm. And one of the things when we wrote Calvin, we really wanted to include grandparents in the story and have them be central to the child's experience, because that intergenerational piece is so important. And children are parts of familial structures.
Yeah.
They're not just, a mom and a dad, or a mom or just a grandparent. It takes everybody. And yes, there is learning and unlearning that needs to happen at different generations.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't believe that people are less open to that learning the older they are. I think that the things might be ingrained more, but they're not less open to learning.
I would say lived experience.
Yes.
Very good, very good. You all have earned your Christmas presents or holiday presents for next year.
Doof.
So Stephen, tell us about how you all walk with families along this topic.
Yeah, so I'm glad we're actually talking about this through a generational lens, because there's actually a marked difference in terms of how young people have conversations around this versus how parents do, and older people in the students' lives. And I'll illustrate this with one of my trainings. So in one of the trainings that I do an exercise before we really start into the meat and potatoes of the training, which is I ask a simple question, which is, what is your earliest memory of an LGBTQ person or this topic? And I asked them to talk about what that memory was, how old they were, where it happened, and was it a positive, negative, or neutral experience? And I can say about 10 years ago when I did this exercise, almost across the board, every single experience that people had was almost universally negative, right? It was always in some way where they encountered this topic and they were told, like, don't do this or don't talk about this or whatnot. I will say that when I do this exact training now, it's actually largely positives, which actually changes sort of the reason, like the purpose of this exercise, because what I'm seeing now is that as there's sort of a new generation of teachers coming into our classrooms, they're actually already talking about this when they were in high school and when they went to college and when they went to grad school, and they're learning about this. And I actually see this as well in the schools, where when I work with parents and when I work with the adults in the students' lives, there are so many concerns and there are so many considerations that are like, well, what about this? Or like, what about the bathroom? Or what about the locker room? Or what if, what about like how we do lunch and all of this stuff? And when you actually go into a classroom and you just introduce a student to the class, students might have a couple of questions, but I will say universally in the last 10 years that I've been doing this, almost every single time this has happened, kids are just like, oh, okay, like we've always known if it was a kid who was already in the school or if it's a new student, they're like, okay, great. And then they get to playing or engaging. So the real challenge in terms of working with families isn't really around what is actually going to happen in the classroom or what is going to actually happen in the school building. Kids are already pretty good at navigating this, and the places where they are not navigating this might be around using, bias-based language or language that isn't sensitive, that is worth talking about in the classroom setting. Really where this work happens and where it's meaningful is making sure that the adults who have all of these adult considerations, all these adult complications, we help navigate those so that those adults have resources, they have people to talk to. And again, if we're going to add a couple of complications, sometimes there are also religious or cultural considerations where I'm not going to be able to speak to a person's religious background or religious upbringing in a way that's going to make sense. And so we also have a lot of community partners that also help bring, who are familiar with this work, who also help with these conversations as well. So parents can learn how to navigate this with their own young people.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. I want to, I see some questions coming into the Q&A. And one of the things I want to explore, and Stephen, maybe you can advise on this. I encourage anyone else to step in on this. As you work with students, do you ever have students who are themselves trying to figure out their gender pronouns, and how do you support them in that process? And how have you seen people come into determining their gender pronouns?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I'm going to go back to the word that we started earlier, which is journey, right? Students sometimes come to us and they have like an identity that they are very clear about in terms of who they are, what their name is, what their pronouns are, and how they want to how they want to be identified in the school or in their lives. But that's not the case of every student, right? And we will have some students who, when they come to us, they're not sure, right? They're struggling a little bit. They know that they want to talk to somebody about this, but they're not exactly sure if this identity actually is right. And part of this is they haven't really used this identity in a lot of places yet. And so what we do in the Boston Public Schools, and what we do in our school in particular, is tell us who you are right now. And that's who you are. But as this moves forward, as you start to find more comfort, as you start to continue building and identifying who you are, right, in terms of your name, your pronoun, and all these different factors in terms of your expression and what you wear to school, that may change. And that's also okay, right? And so, to get back to our original question about how students find those pronouns, I am not here to be a person to tell a student who they are. I am here to make sure that I create the space so students can tell me who they are, and whatever barriers there are for them to be that person, I will be there to remove those barriers, right? If that's the student identification, our student database, if it's making sure that teachers know what the student's name is, or making sure that we have a safety plan so that students can use certain facilities, that's my job. But my job is not to tell another person who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's another question that I see coming up in the chat that I think I want to try and answer. And I want you all to tell me if I am headed in the right direction or if I am on the wrong path. So there's these questions around sort of they, them pronouns and what that means in terms of gender identity. So I'm going to try and answer this. To me, I think from what we've learned today, it sounds like we have gender pronouns that in some cases may reflect male, female, because we've talked about how there are people who exist outside of that binary, then they have other pronouns that they feel like capture who they are. Those pronouns, let's say they and them, may not have anything to do with ideas around masculinity or femininity. It is just a word that they feel like reflects who they are. And sometimes, am I correct, that that's also because they don't see themselves as being male or female or having masculine or feminine identities? Step in and correct me where I may be mistaken.
Yes, I think that perfect. Yeah, I want to add to this also, because I was thinking a lot of things about what JR and Vanessa were saying about supporting their child and all of these things. So again, taking my community educator hat off for just 1 second, because I think this is really important to talk about as well. Sometimes I get the impression, and it's not even just from the trainings I lead, but just kind of cultural, things I see on social media. Sometimes I think we see learning people's pronouns as the end of the road when it comes to, supporting trans folks, non-binary folks, anyone who's gender expansive and doesn't fit in the binary. And so I personally use the pronouns that I use. I use they, them pronouns because it feels to me one of the only ways that I can recognize a feeling that I have always had deeply internally. It is one of the only ways I can have that be recognized by other people. And again, I'm not saying we don't use people's correct pronouns. I could care less about pronouns at the end of the day. And I know many trans folks have the same experience, right? Or people who use pronouns you wouldn't expect have the same experience. It is just literally the baseline of how I feel like I can be seen and heard for who I really feel that I am on the inside. And absolutely, you're perfectly correct, Erin. Not every non-binary or trans person uses, gender neutral pronouns, uses a they, them pronoun. Right? That is deeply personal. Cis people are allowed to use whatever pronouns they want as well, right? This is not a gate-kept thing, right? And oftentimes that is my goal. And as being one of the first people kind of in like my friend and social groups who came out and started expressing these things more verbally, I can check off the list how many friends then started coming to me and saying, seeing you talk about this, right? Even young folks that I've supported, I taught with an AmeriCorps program for 2 years, right? Just being that person with them, people start to think and like, oh, am I allowed to do this too? right? So that is deeply meaningful. Again, one of the questions that I often ask in trainings, if you could express yourself in any way possible without fear of anything else going on, would you do things differently, right? And almost every single person is going to say yes to that, right? If they had the idea of safety, of social acceptance, of love and support from others, right? So pronouns are a baseline, and it's one of the only ways we can name like a deeply personal internal feeling, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for just walking us through also this thing that we don't create monoliths amongst people around gender. So we don't try to make something true for all people in a group, and really remembering to hear the individual in the person. So just to give a heads up for our audience, Stephen, I want to ask you some questions really around policymaking and education and practices because of the work you do with welcoming schools, and also because of your role in a school. And then JR, I want to come to you to talk a little bit about sort of fathers on this journey, and also what it means to be a Black man on this journey. So Stephen, I'm really interested in, you've touched on a number of things that are true for school settings to be gender affirming. But I also want to hear from you really specifically, what are 3 things that school systems and campuses need to be doing to make sure that gender expansive students are safe, healthy, and engaged in their learning experience?
Yeah, so in my work in schools, particularly with welcoming schools, we really look at this through a 3-pronged lens in terms of, so I guess I'll name it first and I'll kind of describe each one. So the 3-pronged lens is really around what are your structural pieces, what are your policy and procedures that exist, right? Then the second one is, what are your instructional pieces in a school? How are you actually teaching kids in a formal setting? And then the third piece is relational in terms of how are you interacting with students? And so just to briefly go over each one of these, you really can't do anything in schools unless it's very clear what the policies and procedures are that exist to support kids. So number one is, does your school, does your district, in some cases, does your state, do they enumerate that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected classes in this building? Right? If you are just relying on like, oh, we're going to create safe, affirming spaces for all, but you're not actually calling out that gender identity and sexual orientation is specifically called out as a protection, right? That kids are protected under, that's a value statement that you're giving to kids. That's a value statement that you are saying that it doesn't matter to name that. And I will say all research shows you should name the things that you are protecting, right? More importantly, than just enumerating things, though, is also, what are you doing with those policies and procedures? Are your staff trained? Are the people who hear comments like "that's so gay" or other things that you often hear on the playground, is there actually a really clear protocol where not just adults, that although that's where it starts, but when kids hear that, they're like, I know where to go to report something like that, right? So those are the structural pieces that you need in place. Some other ones that you can think about are things like, how do you send your parent classroom newsletters home to parents? Do you actually start with dear mom and dad or dear parents, right? Versus dear families, right? Because there's more than just parents that are caring for our young people in our classrooms, right? So these are all policies and procedures that you can think about that all need to be in place. The second piece is actually, what are you teaching in your classes, right? Who are the models that you are using? Are they all, are you using, gender expansive role models in your classrooms? Are you using books? JR and Vanessa wrote Calvin, right? Do books like that, are they accessible in the building? Are they being taught in a formal or informal way? Are there places where students can talk about this? Because I guarantee that kids are talking about this topic. The only question is, how are they talking about it? You can either have it in a place where it's safe, affirming, and in a way where teachers are aware and included in the conversation, or you can have it in the way that I had when I was in school, which is we were just calling everything gay because that was what we did, right? And so that leads to the third piece, which is relationally, how are kids and adults interacting with each other, right? And that builds off of the structural and instructional pieces, which is ultimately, when students come out, are they comfortable with talking to you? Are they comfortable with talking to a teacher or talking to their classmates about this topic? And if they are comfortable, what is around the conversation? And so when you think about those three pieces, that's really the purpose of what we do in Welcoming Schools, is we think about how we build that policy. We think about what the lesson plans and what books and curriculum we can use. And then we also think about what all of this means for how people interact with each other on the ground, right, on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's something like, I think that we so often, rightly so, particularly when we hear about suicide rates and self-harm or anything for gender expansive children, but safety is critically important. Safety is also critically important because it has impacts on how you learn. And so it's always important for me for folks to remember that schools are supposed to be places where learning happens. And anything that gets in the way of learning happening is antithetical to the mission of the school. And so, as you said earlier, like, how do we remove those barriers? How do we create the structures and systems that allow kids to come to school, be safe, feel like they belong, be included, because it helps to facilitate learning? And there's the bonus piece that it helps people become good human beings. So, like, I think that's really like, how do we keep an eye on that? Vanessa, is there anything that you wanted to add sort of as you think about your framing for like gender affirming spaces?
Yeah, I have a very similar structure. I love what Stephen said. I break it down into educate, affirm, include, and interrupt. So educate the staff, the cafeteria staff, the janitorial staff, all of those around you. Affirm in policy and in practice. Both with things as basic as pronouns to the policies that are enumerated. Include, that's the curricular piece. And then I always add interrupt. If you hear something, be the person who is an upstander and stands up for it. You don't have to know exactly how to handle it, but you can be an ally. And we often tell teachers in places that don't have these affirming policies, interrupt with support. There's organizations out there who can give you supporting materials so that you can interrupt what's happening at your campus to make it possible for everybody to thrive.
Mm-hmm. And this feels like a really important point to say to everyone in our audience. One of the things that's going to happen after this event is we're going to share a number of resources because we want you to have those at your disposal. So you will receive those later this week, in addition to a recording of this event. So Vanessa, something that you just said is a great segue for us to talk with JR. So I think so often we, as you all have identified, each parent, folks in a family are going through this journey and discovering some things about themselves. Let's just acknowledge that along the way. And I think that when I think about particularly where folks who have held masculine identities, particularly around the gender binary and what it means to be a man, that this can become challenging, I imagine. I am also a Black person. And so I know the ways in which these topics have been particularly fraught in Black communities. And so, JR, I just wanted you to talk to us a little bit about how this idea of gender expansiveness and race meet, particularly for a father.
Yeah. Oh boy. Do we have 3 hours? I was thinking about this when we were doing some of our prep work, and I really break it down into 2 areas of being a cis heterosexual man. And then being a Black person in this country. And if I look at those in 2 separate silos, growing up as a boy and then becoming a man, it was really in a traditional sense where, I absorbed a lot of what I saw. It was, I was fortunate that I was able to go to a private school and I had the uniforms and everything, but there were already those gender identities already set in place about girls and boys and going into the boys line and going into the girls line. And so from early on, that was something that really kind of stood out to me. Looking about or thinking about being able to express myself as an adult. Where, growing up, you really weren't, supposed to show your emotions, and it was considered vulnerability if you were to express them, where, we live in a, very hyper masculine environment, and then trying to unpack that now as an adult, has required, me to go to a therapist to really find out who I am as a person, and to be accessible to Vanessa and to the kids and to my family. So it really did, as an adult, it really took me that time to figure out, who am I as a person, but also as a caring and supportive human being. To speak about the lived Black experience in this country, you cannot divorce it from racism. You just can't. And so that meant that growing up, from generations before me, meant that it was about safety. It was about preservation of yourself, of your body, and of your mind. And what that meant was that we had, we as the Black community really had to focus on how can we navigate through society in the majority without dying, without violence being enacted towards us. So having all that to talk about now is really extremely, extremely deep. And now that I am in the position that I am, where I have tapped into my emotions, I've tapped into this community that now we're a part of, it's really eye-opening, because as a Black man who has lived through the various experiences that we've had, over the 40 plus years that I've been on this earth, it really goes to show that how much progress have we really made about equality? And now that we're really trying, we're talking about intersectionality, because, I'm a Black man, cis hetero man. We have two kids who are biracial. And then you layer on top of that one who identifies as trans. So think about that, for me as a Black man, it really does involve a lot of brain power and a lot of just being in touch with myself. So, it has been a journey. I will say that over the course of the last 7 years, I have really continued to open up. There have been, roller coasters, just in general, but, about learning about who Ellie is and about what does it mean to support them as a Black man in this country. It's really complex, but I will say that being able to acknowledge that is an incredible step in the right direction. And, in the Black community, we still are navigating through that. But we are making a lot of strides. And I give a lot of credit to the generations that are here now, that are younger than us, that are putting themselves out there, that don't have the lived experiences that we have, that have, I wouldn't say closed us in or limited us, but it has certainly given us a lot of calluses and a lot of, just calluses, that we've built up, where the younger generations are more accepting, they're more supportive, they're more outward, where, I'm a 40-year-old man and I'm still learning about myself, and I just give a lot of accolade and a lot of courage and bravery to those younger generations that, are in this fight. So, yeah.
I just want to note that in the beginning of our journey, there were some who said, oh, it's the liberal white mom who's pushing this on their child, and how terrible this must be for the Black dad. And ironically, in our journey, JR was the very first one in the relationship to support and affirm Ellie with their pronouns and name, and brought me along on that journey. So even the understanding that other people put on our journey based on our own races was really complex.
Yeah, and I just appreciate, JR, too, what you've highlighted and what I feel like in my own journey, recognizing the ways in which people who hold gender expansive identities that have been humble enough to let me into their world, the way it's allowed me to open up and see the world differently. And one of the things that it often reminds me is that folks who are struggling and working hard to be seen and exist, they teach us tremendous things about the ways that we haven't always had the opportunity to be free and exist. And that's some of what I heard in your story, is just this recognition that you get to think differently about how you open up and how you exist in the world, in part because a child helped you in that journey. So it's sort of an invitation to everyone in the ways that I think that we can be resistant and refuse to see that there's really a lot of opportunity for growth and understanding of self as we watch other people step into their own identities, particularly when the world often tells them, no, they can't do that. So I'm paying attention to time. There's one question that I think that we would sort of be remiss if we didn't get to, because I know it's a hot topic. And if we can fit in one more after this, I will. But I'm aware of right now that there are lots of questions around transgender athletes and how they're participating in sports at a high school level and at the college level. Also want to acknowledge the ways in which Title IX provides some protections in this area, depending upon how you interpret Title IX, but that there's still room for clarity on that. So, Stephen, I want to point to you on this and see what can you tell us? And actually, I want to pose this differently. If we're thinking about boards of education and how they're taking on Title IX and the inclusion of transgender athletes, what do we need to understand about this?
Yeah, so this is both a really, really complicated question, but it's also fairly simple, particularly for people in Connecticut or for people in Massachusetts, which is my home state, right? And so I'll start with the complexities before we boil it down to something that I think is pretty easily that's pretty easily followed, right? Which is as we are having these conversations right now, this is actively being debated in like halls of Congress. It's being actively debated in the media. It's actually debated in lots of different places. You really can't escape it right now. And the real important thing to think about is I am not super familiar. I did see some of the comments and questions in the Q&A. I'm not super familiar with what has happened locally in your community, but I do know that in public schools and schools that accept federal funding, which is basically every state public school in the country, you don't really get a choice to follow Title IX. Title IX is a requirement as part of getting funding for your schools. So state boards of education can certainly say like what they want to say about Title IX, but the choice to adopt or not adopt would be very similar to me choosing to adopt or not adopt a speed limit on the highway, right? I can say I don't agree with the 55 mile per hour speed limit, but the fact of the matter is I still have to follow it legally, even if I disagree with it, right? And so it is a really important thing to recognize in terms of like a value statement that your community or a board of education is making with what they say. But in terms of the compliance aspect of that, Title IX still does hold, it is the law of the land, right? And so along those same lines, I'm just going to add locally in terms of in the state of Connecticut, the state of Connecticut has also passed a law that specifically enumerates that gender identity and sexual orientation is a protected class in the state. It's the same as Massachusetts. And along those same lines, when we're talking about athletics, your Connecticut rules with the CIAC is very similar to the MIAA, which is students have the right to participate in the sports programs and activities consistent with their gender identity. Now, who decides what a student's gender identity is? It's the school that decides, right? It's the district that decides what that student's gender identity is. And the districts are held and governed by the state boards of education. In Massachusetts, it's the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed. Connecticut has a similar body, which states that students can hold a gender identity that is different from their sex assigned at birth, and they do not need legal documentation, they do not need medical documentation, they do not need parental consent. If a student tells a school, this is who I am, we take them at their word, right? So as we think about these three layers, right, which is the federal law, Title IX, the state law, which is what Massachusetts and Connecticut has passed, and then you talk about the district level, there are so many redundant levels of protection for these students that what is really happening in terms of these conversations is it's really a conversation around the values of the people having these conversations, as opposed to what the actual protection these kids have legally in these settings. Now, I say all of this not as legal advice, but just to kind of set the context of sort of, what could be happening in lots of different communities around the country right now.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you mentioned earlier that one of the things that we need to remember too is that one of the groups that's particularly harmed when we don't recognize these protections is transgender students. And so how do we remember who's harmed in this process? Okay, we have time for one more question, and I'd like for each of you to answer it. And it's a question that came in on our chat. So the question is, I will start with JR and Vanessa. How can we support parents who are struggling to let go of the child they thought they knew?
Parents, you always have this vision in your head when you find out you're having a child in whatever way that is of what their future will be. And I think any parent can note that that is completely thrown out the window the first second you have that baby at home. And this is just another piece of that journey. There is a trope within the parent community that we do not ascribe to around grief and mourning of the child before. I have a dear friend who says that for many people, it's actually the loss of privilege that folks are mourning. The idea that now they have a child who potentially is targeted by others and maybe not having the same privilege as they maybe had before. But we certainly don't ascribe to that grief. I would say for parents who are first on this journey, find other parents to talk with. Make sure that you are connected in online and local groups, because the more you are informed and work through your own issues, the less that will impact your child. And your child doesn't need to see you going through that work, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, if I could add, I've said this before and it's pretty direct, but it's not about you. It's about the child. It's about supporting the child. So separating yourself and letting yourself be open to learning about something that's different from what you have assumed, because as you said, when you have a child, you're expecting one thing, but most of the time you probably will get something other than that. So you have to really be prepared mentally of the changes, whether you have a gender nonconforming kid or a cisgender kid. It's about being prepared and showing up and using the opportunity to learn about what's going to be the journey of that child and of the family and of the community that will support that kid.
And I guess I can put on my
educator
hat and maybe take a note from Cadence, where I can note that this is someone's experience and I don't want to negate their experience by saying that's not how we feel. Yeah. But I think that this idea of letting go of expectations is something that parents need to work on in general, because we have so many expectations. And whether you have a trans child or a differently abled child or a child who has some other aspect to them, uniqueness. It's actually a really beautiful thing to behold. And once you start focusing on those positive pieces and the joy and the authenticity of that kid, it eradicates any of those other feelings.
Very good. Cadence, we'll come to you. How do you suggest supporting parents who are struggling to let go of the child they thought they knew?
Yeah. And this is a really interesting experience for me to go through as someone who kind of did this to my parents, right? And again, sometimes I have to be taking on and off hats constantly through a training. I have had those really intense, like grief, confusion ridden questions said to me. I've had it said in trainings, like to my face, like, I feel like my child died, right? And I just think it's really important that we name that people will say those things. And because, and again, as a person who is just empathetic, like I can understand what that would feel like. But again, a human is a human. We have to treat them like a human, regardless of their age, and they tell us who they are and what they need. I also always like to note, regardless, because I lead trainings for all sorts of different groups, and regardless if it's, faculty and staff in a school, if it's another nonprofit organization, if it's a social support agency, if it's like a corporate workplace that I'm leading a training for, I always, without fail, get questions from a parent perspective, even if that is not the focus of the training. Even again, not even just parents, like anyone who has a young person in their life and is trying to figure out how to support them. Without fail, every single training I think I would say I have ever led. Another thing I think I see happen a lot of the time, and I was hearing this a lot in what JR was saying about his experiences as well. So especially from folks who are already experiencing marginalization, especially, but I think everyone does this, is often the reaction I hear is, and a parent is often not even conscious of this, is like, I do not want my child to have this identity because I know people are going to treat them potentially badly, and life is going to be harder for them because they have this identity. But then we create a circle in which having those feelings and enacting them some way in the way you raise and treat your child, you are becoming one of the people who is making it harder for them. So it's a circle. And I think talking about it that way is so important, right? Because we already know it's a hard world to live in. And I think that's the reaction, right? Is I don't want it to be harder. But again, if you're one of the people who is saying you can't be this way, I'm going to pretend it's not your experience, that you don't exist with this identity, you're becoming one of those people making it harder. So the less often we have that reaction, the better we're all going to be, right?
Yeah, thanks. Stephen, how would you add to this?
I guess I would just add one additional thing, which is, if this is a conversation that needs to happen at school, or if this is a conversation where you're helping your child transition at school, there are people who are in school districts who do support this. Every district is required to have a Title IX officer at the very minimum, right? And so that might be a point person to talk to if you're not quite sure. But most schools also at this point have a GSA, which is a Gender and Sexuality Alliance, is the term we use. Like, find who the GSA advisor is. Find the people who are going to be allies to your child, because it's too important to not find out who those people are, because your student and your child, like, the most important thing in all of the research that we've seen so far, and the critical aspect of this work, is making sure that in the aspects of your child's life, and school is a huge part of that life, there are safe, supportive people that your young person can go to. And so they exist in your school district, they exist in school districts around this country, but it does sometimes take more work in some areas than others, but they do exist, and it's really, really important. It is worth finding who the safe people are, who the welcoming people are, and ultimately to create a critical mass of people where you don't have to identify those people, because everybody is.
Thank you for that, y'all. And I also just want to name, so Stephen has given a great example about schools. Cadence, I'm going to plug your organization, so Triangle Community Center. And then JR and Vanessa, can you please say the name of the group that you all work with at Human Rights Campaign?
Sure. We're part of the Human Rights Campaign Parents for Transgender Equality Council, and it's comprised of families from around the country who are more public in our advocacy and working to be kind of connectors within communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So you can also hear just a couple of resources, and again, we'll share those. So to all of you all, Stephen, JR, Vanessa, and Cadence, thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the pre-meetings. Thank you for all the time that you put into this. I also want to thank our YWCA Greenwich team, Zachary Kyle, Eileen O'Connor, Alec Lassard, Kathy Seiden, Mary Lee Kiernan, and our Women's Empowerment and Racial Justice team for helping to plan this event tonight and execute it. I know that for many of you, this was something else on your plate of things to do, so thank you. So thank you to everyone in our audience who tuned in tonight. We hope that you'll continue to join us for these events and partner with us as we continue in our mission to eliminate racism and empower women, and also end gender oppression. And in the coming days, as we mentioned, you're going to receive an email. It's going to have the event recording in it. It will have the bios for all of our panelists, and it will have a list of resources that will span a number of topics related to tonight's topic. And then please look for future events that we're going to be doing through the Center for Equity and Justice that are going to be coming up. One of those is our annual event, which is Stand Against Racism, which will be in April. And we also always do something at Town Hall. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Connie Blunden, who helped us consider the ways in which we should change the name of tonight's event so that it honored women who have often remained invisible in movement. So thank you, Connie. Everybody have a good night, and we'll see y'all soon.